Okay, so chapter 32 is bringing together two movements that are kind of connected with each other. And you should be able to see how they're connected with each other as we go through this. What we call liberalism in Protestantism, liberal Protestantism. Sometimes these are called, today, the mainline churches. And then the social gospel. And this term liberal is one that we've talked about before, and it's got a lot of uses in today's politics. If you call somebody a liberal, it's sort of a dirty word in many circles, and some people want to avoid it and use the word progressives. It means something different overseas, of course. Some people actually pointed that out. You know, I know that's the case, that liberal actually means what we call conservative in certain respects if you're over in France or Germany. The social gospel is going to be something that's actually going to come out of this, a particular emphasis. Now, when we use this term liberal, we want to ask the question, liberal in comparison to what? And usually, what's the term that we counterpose to liberal?
Conservative.
Yeah. So, and then if you want to be really clever or smart, if any of you are, really into history of political science, you'll say, well, liberals originally meant what we nowadays call conservatives. They're both part of the grand liberal tradition, coming out of John Locke and that sort of business. But what do we mean when we say conservative? Don't just think like, hot button issues like abortion or capital punishment. What does it mean to be conservative? Yeah.
Traditional.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Wanting to hold on to ways that are already established, traditions that are in place. Were you going to say about the same thing?
I was going to say traditional, yeah.
The word tradition is kind of important. What else do you associate with it? What do conservatives tend to resist?
Change.
Yeah. Now, it gets really blurry today because conservatives today are actually trying to change things quite a bit, in part because liberalism in many areas has become the status quo. It's become conservative. So these words get really messy and mixed up. When we're talking about the early 20th century and the lead up to it, what would it mean to be conservative at that time? I mean, even most liberals of that time would strike us as pretty conservative in many respects. That's something worth thinking about. The term that we're going to end up counterposing, not so much in this chapter, but in later chapters, to liberal, is going to be fundamentalist. And in the early 1900s, particularly in the 1920s, there's going to be a lot of conflict between liberals, or what are often called modernists at that time, and fundamentalists. And liberals are basically going to win the institutional battle to hold on to the churches and who's in charge, and particularly who's in charge of teaching at seminaries, who's in charge of the leadership. And the fundamentalists are going to find themselves sort of pushed out, and they're going to form their own churches. We're going to see splits occur in some of the main Protestant denominations, and not all conservatives are fundamentalists. As a matter of fact, not all biblical literalists, not all people who believe that the Bible is literally true, are fundamentalists. There's a particularly narrow conception of the term, and precise conception of the term that we're going to look at in one of the later chapters. But this is the main struggle here. And we're not going to really talk that much about the fundamentalist side, because what we want to focus on is the liberal side. So your book talks about certain key themes, and I listed them here. The focus on process and progress and growth, not only in terms of the individual, but in terms of society, in terms of institutions. To be a liberal at that time meant to have this viewpoint that human beings had been developing, from prehistory through a number of different stages, and modern human beings, particularly modern European and American human beings, were kind of at the pinnacle of it. Things were just getting better and better and better, and there was, kind of a monkey wrench thrown into that with the First World War, and later on, especially with some of the things that occurred in the 30s and 40s. But that was a very common viewpoint at the time. And when you have a process, there's no radical jumps. Things are ongoing. Think about classes, for example. The way I've set up this class is you have a lot of writing assignments, little bits and pieces here and there. So if you miss one of them, your grade doesn't completely plummet. It's not like you should be investing all of your time in any one single writing assignment, putting all the eggs into that basket. How do some people set up their classes that would be very different? One paper due at the end, or 3 papers over the course of the semester. And everything is like backloaded to the very last thing, and people start to panic because you got several classes like that, and it tends to produce work that isn't very good. Where did I put my coffee there? That would be discontinuity. That would be something different than process. Process means you're like doing a bit here, a bit there. The change is kind of gradual. That's the way that these people are seeing the religious process. So we're going to come back to that in a moment. Eroding sharp lines or boundaries. Liberals are often the ones to say, well, can't we all just get along? These distinctions aren't really that important. And conservatives are usually the ones saying, no, these distinctions really do matter. We can't just get rid of them altogether. So think about, for example, religious denominations. By now or I hope you do, what differentiates Presbyterians from, say, Baptists from Anglicans. You can set some dividing lines between them that have to do with distinctives. What's distinctive to Presbyterians? Predestination, for example. Now, do all Presbyterians necessarily believe in predestination? I think quite a few of them today don't. And quite a few Presbyterians today in some of the mainline churches, which are all in one big church, Presbyterian Church USA, look an awful lot like Methodists in the United Methodist Church, or people in some of the other mainline churches. Those dividing lines get kind of blurred. They're felt to be less important. Whereas a conservative Presbyterian will say, no, we don't agree on this. Here would be a great example in terms of Lutherans. Years back, the Catholic Church and the largest Lutheran body in the world signed a joint agreement on declaration. They signed a joint agreement on justification by faith, which was one of the key things that Luther was all about, right? And they said, well, when we look at the documents, it kind of turns out that maybe we weren't so different, and the dividing lines weren't so sharp as we thought. Now, if you talk to a Missouri Synod Lutheran, they will say, we didn't sign that. We don't agree with that. We set down a line in the sand. So liberals tend to erase lines in the sand, you could say. Biblical studies was a growing discipline at the time. And if you were to take other religious studies classes here at Marist, for instance on the New Testament or on the Old Testament, what you would find is you would not be studying it from a denominational perspective. You wouldn't be studying it as a Catholic, or as a Lutheran, or as a Presbyterian. You wouldn't even have to be a committed Christian. What you'd be doing is you'd be looking at the texts and what the biblical scholars have told us about the development and history of these texts. So I mentioned this in a previous class. Book of Isaiah, for example, one of the longest books in the Bible. Turns out it was probably written, according to modern biblical studies, the higher criticism, it was probably written by multiple authors, not just one guy whose name was Isaiah. Now, does that sandbag or shipwreck faith? It really depends. If your faith depends on every single thing being just the way that you thought it was, that's going to be a big problem then. That's going to be a mind blower. Realizing that the different books of the Bible were written at different times by people who had different perspectives on things. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to say it's not divinely inspired. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to say that God is not involved in the process at all. But biblical studies would focus more on the human element of it. Here's one example that comes up in the book of Genesis. There's two different stories for the creation of human beings in Genesis. Why are there two different stories? Well, one of the theories is that each of these reflects a different perspective. One reflects a priestly point of view. I forget what the other source was, like a folk point of view. And then they get brought together in one single text. So modern biblical studies is taking off, and it's particularly taking off in Germany. And whether you realize it or not, German university education is really responsible for the kind of education that we do today in higher ed. Your professors, what kind of degrees do they have? Hopefully they have degrees, right? So every once in a while you find out that they didn't do the background check on somebody, they don't actually have a degree in what they say they do. It's happened more than, I don't know if it's happened here at Marist, but it's happened at places where I've taught before. What kind of degrees should they have? A BA? Like what you guys are working on? They should have that to start with.
Yeah.
What else?
A master's.
Okay, a master's, that's a good position. And if this were 100 years ago, most of the people teaching would only have a master's degree here in the United States. What do most of your professors have? I know there's some people with MFAs and...
Like PhD.
Yeah. Now, what does a PhD mean?
Like philosophy of something. No.
Doctor of Philosophy, yeah. And now, do all of them study philosophy? Of course not. But it's sort of an honorific title. And in order to get a PhD, you're going beyond the master's thesis. How many of you are thinking about going to grad school? Okay, let me add to that. How many of you are thinking of going to professional school as well? Like law school, getting an MBA, things like that. Okay, so quite a few of you are going on to graduate education. At the master's level, you produce some sort of artifact, some sort of research. If you're doing a creative thing like an MFA, you create a project. And it takes a lot of time and work. Mine was about 110 pages. And that was actually the second one that I wrote because I abandoned the first one. And you have to take some coursework and, probably a qualifying exam or something like that. At the PhD level, how is that different? You got to take some more coursework, and by that time you might actually be teaching these days. What else do you have to do at the PhD level? What qualifies the people who are teaching you to actually teach?
They make a paper and then they have to defend it.
Yeah, what's that paper called?
Thesis defense.
Thesis is at the master's level.
Dissertation.
Dissertation. And a dissertation is a book. A lot of them actually get turned into books that get published. So my dissertation was about 450 pages. And it took me about 2 years to write.
What did you write about?
I wrote about this guy, Marist, this philosopher, and modernism and Catholicism, because he was a Catholic thinker. And I never published it because it got way too big, and it was, it was a sprawling work, and I'm not very proud of it. But that was a long time ago. But once you actually do that, you're qualified. You have to defend it, of course, and sometimes they get rejected if they're not any good. That all comes from this German system. And a lot of Americans, there weren't a lot of these graduate degrees offered at American universities at the time. Later on, we copied the German system, pretty much wholesale. So they would go over to Germany to study. And that's where this higher criticism was really taking hold. So theologians and philosophers and historians and literary people, they would go over to Germany and they'd get exposed to all these ideas, and then they'd come back. And then, of course, once you learn an idea, you want to try to apply it. You want to start using it. So that's another key element. Evolution, we're going to talk about that a bit more. I put that in all caps because that turned out to be sort of like the rallying point where the conservatives and the liberals were really fighting each other. And still are to some degree today, over what should be taught in school. Nowadays it's usually in terms of creationism versus evolution. But that's coming from this era. And then an intense focus on ethics. So your book talks about some key figures, but I'm going to actually only hit on a few of them. One of the ones that fits in with this notion of process is this Horace Bushnell. And he's a Congregationalist who wrote this book called The Discourse on Christian Nurture. Now, when you talk about nurture, what does that mean? If I nurture you. I'm not actually a very nurturing guy. I'm more of a take it or leave it kind of guy.
Like you're like there every step of the way, like helping them.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Think about a coach who's like always there for you, and they're not, they don't come down on you and say, "You're doing it wrong, dummy." They're like, I think if you let's use swimming, right?
Yeah.
I don't know anything about swimming, so I'm going to make this up. I think your stroke is like this, but you really want to be, putting your hand like that, and they like guide you through it. That's being nurturing. And it's bit by bit by bit, step by step by step. And so Bushnell is undercutting this evangelical assumption. Remember, the evangelicals thought that you have to have a conversion experience. That's how you know you're saved. You have to, have this moment where you say, "Come on, Jesus," or "Welcome, Lord," or "I'm such a sinner and now I'm going to be saved." Whatever it's going to be. There's a lot of different variations on this. There has to be some crux, some crisis. And Bushnell said, no, you don't actually need that. It can just be this constant, steady growth in spirituality. He said, this is only important if you believe in original sin, and he de-emphasized original sin. So, what does this lead to? Bushnell talks, and this is, about this eroding the sharp lines as well. Bushnell talks about the divine and the human being in a complementary relationship, so that God's grace redeems the imperfect realm of human activities. So, what would it be like? Well, it would, if you think about children, for example, what are the important institutions in a child's life?
School.
Okay, school. What else? Family. Of course, church, because we're talking about religion. That's assuming they're going to church. And what else? What if we get a little bit bigger?
Like the influence of media.
Yeah, now he's not that concerned about that at the time, but if he were around today, he'd be like looking at social media and what it does, and television. He probably wouldn't be very happy with it, right? But he might reconsider some of his ideas. The general idea was that through school, through home, through church, through society as a whole, you would take a child and bit by bit nurture them in Christianity. So they would never have to have this experience of like feeling like they're radically damaged and need some sort of fundamental change. Instead, it would just be this continual progressive growth, getting better and better and better. So that's these two elements here. The biblical studies, like I said, the German universities were really taking the lead with this. And the way your book characterizes this is very nice. It says, they regarded the Hebrew and Christian scriptures not as a homogeneous, unified, divinely revealed pair of documents, but rather as a collection of religious texts that have been written, edited, that's very important, edited or redacted, and collected within their respective communities over many centuries. And so it talks a bit about form criticism. Form criticism, your book doesn't actually go into any detail about it. Here's, in a nutshell, what they would do in form criticism. They would focus on what's called the Sitz und Leben, which means sort of like the particular kind of situation that a text was written for. So they would say this text was, coming out of this particular kind of situation, this kind of need oriented towards this kind of audience. It might not be meant for this audience over here. It might not apply quite as well. So this goes against the notion that you can just take the Bible as one big unified document and just kind of pick out whatever you like, do like what they call proof texting. You know, a lot of people, when they want to appeal to the Bible, they just start looking for a verse that'll sound sort of like what they want to say. That's proof texting. The proof is that you've got a text to back up what you're saying. That's a very layman's way of putting this. This would be a rejection of that. This would be a more sophisticated attitude towards that. So liberals didn't see this as a big problem. They saw this as an affirmation that God's message had not been revealed in a static form, but through a process, an ongoing process. This did not go over well with many people who had a much more traditional attitude towards Scripture. So, we talked about this before. If there's one figure to associate with evolution, even though he, of course, did not come up with the idea, had been around for a long time before him, it's who? It's Charles Darwin. And Darwin writes The Origin of Species. There's actually a reading group here on campus that every so often picks it up and actually reads it. There's a lot of people who talk a lot about Darwin and evolution and never actually read what the guy said. You'd be surprised. It's not quite so clear-cut in some circumstances. You know, he'd say, the eye is difficult for me to explain. But he thought that he could provide some pretty conclusive scientific evidence that species developed over time. We talked about this before. That's a problem if you think that God created them all at the beginning and they haven't changed at all through time. If you have a more process view, not really a problem for you. As a matter of fact, most of the churches around today don't have a problem with evolution. It's a minority of churches that do. But that took a while to develop. The next book is kind of a bombshell because it's about the descent of man. And there he's saying that we're actually one of the apes. So that goes against the notion that human beings are somehow privileged, are special. Now, like he says, conservatives protested the theory of evolution deprived humanity of its unique character and God of his special creative power. It also went against the literal accuracy of opening chapters of Genesis. And on a moral plane, what's the word, or not the word, what's the catchphrase that you associate with Charles Darwin and evolution? Survival what?
Of the fittest.
Of the fittest. Now, what does that mean in economic terms or in the workplace?
Dog eat dog.
Yeah, exactly. And what we call social Darwinism was something that a lot of people embraced, but a lot of people were actually quite against it. As a matter of fact, nowadays we associate social Darwinism with conservatives. The conservatives of the day were against social Darwinism for the most part. There tend to be more progressives behind it saying, well, you know, the weaker will get weeded out. The ones who are unfit to survive will not last. This got applied, by the way, in terms of race, too. Way beyond, you know, what the evidence would support. There were hopes that, you know, all the inferior races, and, you know, who was inferior really depended on who was doing the talking about this, didn't it? That the inferior races would be sort of weeded out over time. That was part of social Darwinism. That was sort of an illegitimate extension of Darwin's theory into social areas. But it was closely associated with that. Now, the other thing is this focus on ethics. And this is what leads us now to the social gospel. So, your book talks about this guy, Walter Rauschenbusch, who brought Jesus' teaching to bear on human experience in terms of the poor. He starts out working in Hell's Kitchen, which, you know, nowadays we associate that with the Gordon Ramsay show more than anything else, right? But at that time, it meant the slums. the real hardcore, poverty-stricken, people will kill you for, your shoes kind of slums. And he's carrying out ministry there, trying to reach the people. We've seen this theory, this theme a number of times, trying to reach the people who are unchurched, who are not being dealt with. And so he's looking particularly at who tended to be the poor at this time. There was some, what we call generational poverty. Generational poverty is when your parents were poor, your grandparents were poor, all the way back, as far as you can remember. You don't have the resources that, other people sort of take for granted. You don't envision anything other than that for yourself. And so you stay poor. And you probably make the sort of bad life decisions that will keep you poor. But it wasn't so much generational poverty. Who was coming into the United States around this time?
Well, you had immigrants.
Yeah. And, America was just getting flooded with immigrants from all over the place. There's actually a great book out there called How the Irish Became White. The Irish were not considered white by white people at the time that a lot of these developments in the 19th century were taking place. Why not? Because, they were Catholic and they were backwards Celts, from the Irish Isles, and they spoke a weird kind of jumbled up English, if they spoke English at all, and they would work for, as cheap as possible. They were like the lowest class of society for a while, at least in, New York and places like that, and eventually they claw their way up. There were a lot of other cases like that. Slavs, intense suspicion and prejudice against people from the Slavic countries. Other South Europeans, like Italians. There's also Mexican immigration going on. There's also some very important immigration happening within the United States about this time as well. That has to do with the African Americans. Where are most of the African Americans located around the time of the Civil War? South. And then what happens? Emancipation. What happens?
They go north to escape.
Yeah. So it's not just immigrants from Europe or from other places. It's also migration coming up to to the northern cities, and this generates a lot of poor people, a lot of poor areas, and so the social gospel, the emphasis is on this gospel part, and whenever you see gospel, you ought to think about this Jesus guy. So what was Jesus' attitude towards poor people, the ordinary Joes? They say, come back when you got some more money. I don't want you in church. You're not dressed right. You're not going to find anything like that in the Gospels. What was his attitude towards poverty and towards the poor? If you had to generalize.
There was special care for them. Like he held them slightly above normal people.
Yeah, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. I mean, it depends on which verses you're emphasizing, right? He also didn't say, do anything you want, you should be thrifty. Look at some of the parables, like of the talents and all that. But, think about, the loaves and the fishes story. His apostles, they're way out in the desert, and there's no food. And his apostles were like, man, what are we going to do with this crowd here? Everybody's here to listen to you, and nobody's got any food. This is going to turn kind of ugly. Why don't you send them, to town to get some food? He says, well, I don't want them to faint along the way. And then, you guys all know the story of the loaves and the fishes. Some boy has got a basket that has some loaves, and they start passing it around, and it never ends up being exhausted, and they actually end up having everybody fed and way more food than they started with originally. And what was the really key thing of that thing? Jesus says, Jesus takes pity on them. He says, I don't want to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the road. I want to take care of them. And so for a lot of Christians, it was felt that, look, if you're really a Christian and you've got all these poor people, then you ought to be orienting your Christian worship, your Christian service towards the poor. And so Rauschenbach talks about that. And another dimension of this would be changing society. What are some of the things that keep people poor? Just to think about it in our own time terms.
Their job.
Yeah, okay, so how do jobs keep people poor?
Like, I don't know, you don't make enough money so you can't, like, buy things. Or, like,
Yeah.
I don't know, you don't have the skill set to, like, move up in the world.
Yeah, and once you get stuck with a job and all the dependencies that go along with that, like having a car, having to pay for insurance, having a place to live that you got to pay rent on or pay property taxes on or pay a mortgage on, and then start having kids, it becomes very difficult to move from one job to another. And there are, programs and opportunities to do that, but for many people even today, really especially today, there's a lot of what we call dead-end jobs, and they're not dead-end jobs just because they're unsatisfying. They're dead-end jobs because once you get into them, it's difficult to get yourself out of them and to move up, even if you really want to. You have to really apply yourself. People get depressed, We're actually at a point in time now where there are people who've been out of work for years who had work before, and they'll take anything they can get. For a while, they were too proud. They said, "I'm not going to take, minimum wage job," but now they will. There were a lot of conditions like that, and the safety net that we talk about today didn't really exist back then. Nowadays, we have this sort of governmental and state, safety net. Churches, by the way, still do massive charity outreach. In some areas, the churches do more than the federal or state governments do, as far as like the poor. But it was felt that unless you actually change the rules of the game, change society, you're just going to be perpetuating poverty by providing people with charity. You really have to transform things through what? Through laws, perhaps, through raising wages. What else might fit in there? Education, even things as simple as, you might not associate this with like changing society, but teaching people how to parent well. A lot of people are in poverty because their parents don't know how to parent. And by the way, before I'm sure somebody's going to get angry on YouTube and say, "Who are you to blame them?" But that's not to say that's the sole cause. But these sort of programs actually are quite effective. There's a program that would fit in with this quite well. I don't know if it actually had a religious orientation originally. It was called Read to Me, Daddy. And quite a few of the guys, when I was teaching in a maximum security prison, would participate in this. And what they would do is they would send books to these prisoners whose kids, have a dad in prison, which puts them at a pretty severe disadvantage in a lot of respects. And the dad would actually just read the book to the kid, and it would be tape recorded. And then they'd send the tape recording along back with the kid. And you might say, well, that's really nice. Well, who cares? It's just nice for that one little kid. He gets to, or she gets to hear their dad. Well, it turns out that father's involvement with a child's life is one of the best predictors for a whole bunch of things, whether a child flourishes or does poorly. So if you were to actually put together a program like that, that could actually be an expression of the social gospel. It would make sense within that format. It would be transformative. So this social gospel movement, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It incorporates not only Protestants but also some Catholics. Your book mentions Monsignor John Ryan, who came up with the notion of the just wage. And another thing that comes out of this is a focus on social science. When we say social science, what do we mean? These are often, lumped together as the social studies when you're in high school. Here we have a college of social sciences. What disciplines are part of that? Yeah.
Psychology.
Very good. That's the social.
Sociology.
Yeah, sociology. What were you going to
I was
say?
going to say like anthropology.
Anthropology fits in there as well. Do we have a program here in anthropology?
I don't know if we have a specific one for it, but
Yeah.
I haven't taken a course on it, so I don't think so.
You don't find so many of those programs. Did you have your hand up too?
No, I was gonna say I don't think we do.
Okay. To a certain extent, economics, depending on how you're doing it, can be understood as a social science. These often are criticized for being activist disciplines, for not just sticking to the data, but for trying to change things by accumulating the data. And that is, in fact, what a lot of people in the social sciences do, but that comes out of this. So there's what the book talks about is an alliance between theology and social science, and it begins to take shape in the new field of social ethics. Again, the focus is on saying we need to change society. We need to figure out how to make society better so there's not going to be so many people poor and stuck being poor for their entire life and being cut off from all the advantages that everybody else enjoys. And for Christians, this is, again, coming out of the gospel imperative. That's, again, why it's called the social gospel. So this leads to what's eventually called the institutional church. And the institutional church is, in a certain way, a revival of some of the things that churches used to do. And in a certain way, it's a new thing. Before the government took over certain functions, a lot of charity was handled by churches. A lot of outreach to poor people. But it was done generally in a non-systematic way. So here's some examples of things that they use as, St. George and Bartholomew in Manhattan. Any of you guys from the city and you know this particular church? St. George's and Bartholomew. They offer weekly worship, right, which churches do. But they also extended their professional staff and program and physical plan to promote a wide variety of outreach endeavors. So what did these include? Daycare. Providing daycare for people. Why would that be important? Yeah.
Because that allows their parents to both work,
Yeah.
jobs.
And you know where the kids are. They're not getting in trouble, That can turn out to be the make or break for a lot of families. Daycare is expensive. You guys will start realizing this when you start having kids. Summer outings for poor urban children. Why is that important? Taking kids out of the city.
So they can experience.
Go ahead.
Just so that they can experience life outside their own bubble.
Yeah, they can imagine something different. That's key.
I was just gonna say it cultures them, so they learn there's more than just the city. There's other parts of life in the world and stuff.
It's easier to envision yourself somewhere else when you've seen somewhere else. I knew a person who grew up in L.A., and she grew up in L.A. in the 60s, and she was dirt poor. And L.A. smog was so bad at that time that light pollution was bad too. You couldn't see the stars at night at all. But the smog was just terrible as well. And it was one of these sort of programs. They took a bunch of kids out of the city. She wasn't even Christian. She was a Jewish kid. And they took her into the foothills. And she had a religious experience because she saw the stars actually for the first time when she was in her teens. And it was kind of an awesome experience. And it really struck her. She realized, man, I don't have to live like this. This is something better. Educational training programs. Churches do that as well. Why is that important if you want to transform society? Why is that?
They could provide someone with an opportunity, if someone can't afford education on their own, if you give it to them, they can get a job or something they normally couldn't do.
Yeah, I mean the government does quite a bit of that stuff. Not at this time though. At this time that we're talking about, the government doesn't do any of that. So churches doing that is really revolutionary. It's paving the way for people to do things. The book talks about this as being part of a larger movement called social Christianity. And we've mentioned the YMCA before. These also have Catholic and Jewish counterparts. Urban gospel missions, the Salvation Army. These are all part of this larger effort to apply Christianity in terms of society. And your book talks about the effects of the social gospel. It brought about a number of different important changes, some of which are still around today. We tend to see what they call faith-based efforts as something that the conservatives are mostly involved in. Really, the religious left has been doing this since the social gospel movement started. This is an ongoing, behind-the-scenes kind of process. It happens not just in liberal Protestantism, but also in the Catholic Church. There's a lot of Jewish outreach things as well. Religious organizations have been doing this sort of thing for quite some time. The last thing that your book really talks about in this chapter is another variety of Protestant liberalism, and it has to do with what's called modernism. So this would go to what my dissertation actually focused on to a certain extent, although I was more focusing on Catholic modernism than Protestant modernism. And even if you haven't heard this term used in religious contexts, you probably have a good idea about what this means. And you also want to be careful with this. Modernism means a lot of different things in a lot of different areas. So in literature it means something different. In art it means something different. In architecture it means something different. In music it means something different. Here we're talking about it in terms of religion. And the modernists were these people at major universities and divinity schools who started constructing a theology that was based not on revelation or reason, but directly on human religious experience. And your book doesn't actually stress this well enough, but religious experience was understood as being based on certain basic human needs, which include a need for the transcendent. Here's the basic idea. All of us need to have some sort of connection to something bigger than us that provides us with meaning. And some of us are able to find this in our careers. Some of us are able to find this in family and relationships. But one way that people have traditionally found this is in terms of religion. And that's, if you have the modernist sort of perspective, that's where the religious impulse comes from. And then people get excited about religion and they pass this stuff down because they have religious experiences. If you don't actually have any sort of experience, you're probably going to be kind of left cold. Now there are some people who do a lot of talking about religion but don't have any basis in experience, but those people tend to be, less credible. They tend to be, the ones that don't produce a lot of effect. So, what would be an example of religious experience? We talked about the conversion experience, the feeling that one is somehow damaged, sinful, tainted with the effects of original sin, and along comes Christ, and through one's relationship with Christ, one is reborn, one is renewed, one is redeemed, one becomes a different, better kind of person. That was a very common religious experience. So the modernists are less interested in the theology, and they're more interested in what is that actual experience like? What does it feel like? Under what circumstances does it happen? What kind of people does it happen with? And so William James, American philosopher, his Varieties of Religious Experiences, sort of a scientific study of this. And it's not aiming at the destruction of supernatural faith, but an appreciation of what religion in fact does. So there's also a focus on the effects of religion. And there's a lot of different ways in which this takes shape. Your book talks about, the University of Chicago is sort of leading the way with this, the School of Christian Personalists around Boston University. And all these people are interested in putting the analysis of religious truth on an experiential or empirical basis. Now, what form do you think this would take today? Is this merely historical, or, you hear people say, well, this works for me. That's why I'm into this. I wanted to study this particular religious movement, and I found that it had merit and value for me. It met my needs. It produced good effects in my life. It changed, me. I'm not saying it has universal validity. Somebody else might have a totally different need for a different kind of thing. But what worked for me was this. Have you heard people talk like that? About not even necessarily religious, but transcendent experiences, things that give their life meaning? That would be sort of typical expressions of this view. I think a lot of the spiritual but not religious people, we put that in scare quotes because it's used so often, I'm spiritual but not religious. A lot of them could get behind this and fit into this as well. And this has its origins in the early 20th century for the most part, the late 19th century. Your book also talks about neo-orthodoxy, but I'm going to skip over that because it's talked about in a later chapter.